Alright, so we're looking at conditional statements yet again. Now, as soon as we start looking at this next section of conditional statements, we're just going to introduce a couple ways the rules can get more complicated and start working ourselves into some more complicated kinds of conditional statements. Biggest thing we need to pay attention to, though, is review and remember this lovely chart. So, important things to remember for when we start mixing up tenses of conditions. First, this chart very clearly has two sides. Whoops. We'll go back again, clicking randomly. We have simple conditions and we have contrafactual conditions. Even when we start mixing up tenses, conditions will remain either simple, that is indicative in both halves of the condition, or contrafactual, subjunctive in both halves of the condition. So, even when things start mixing up, you're going to have either an indicative condition or a subjunctive condition. One will have would and these other lovely words, were, had been, should be, or were to be. The other will just translate like normal indicatives. So, once again, don't let this confuse you too much. If it's simple, just translate it. It's just simple. It's indicatives. Translate it exactly as you would if it weren't in a condition, and it will not lead you astray. If it's subjunctive, it's a little harder. But once again, we're still just limited to these three different options and three different Latin tenses. We're going to use the imperfect subjunctive, the pluperfect subjunctive, or the present subjunctive for all of these sentences. So, let's look at what mixed conditions could even mean. So here's a couple examples in English to give us an idea. We'll talk through them really quickly and talk through what Latin tenses, moods we would need for these sentences. Number one, if he were walking to school, he would have already been here. So, we can look at this condition. First thing, once again, get in the habit of always doing this. Look in the main clause of the sentence, is there a would? If we have would here, it's going to be contrafactual, which means we're using subjunctives. So, if he were walking to school, he would have already been here. We're in contrafactuals. Alright, as soon as we see that, we have to ask, what time are these actions occurring? So, he would have already been here. Have already been, or have already arrived here. Probably, if I were to translate this into Latin, I'd switch it from been to arrived. He would have already arrived here if he were walking. Would have already arrived. Would have been. Those are both past. So it's going to be past contrafactual for that main clause. If we go back a page and look at this, once again, past contrary to fact is going to use pluperfect subjunctives. So we're going to use a pluperfect subjunctive for he would have already been here. But if we come to that C clause, the if clause, if he were walking is something that is occurring now. We've got this present idea. If he were doing this thing right at this moment, this would have happened. So here we would use a present subjunctive. Well, sorry, we need to express present, and if we come back here, present, contrary to fact, these present contrafactual conditions are imperfect subjunctives. So we want to express a present idea, but because, once again, Latin has no future subjunctive, we shift tense back. So we're using the imperfect subjunctive here. So, if he were walking to school, this is a present contrafactual taking an imperfect subjunctive. He would have already been here. He would have already arrived. He would have already been here. This is going to be past contrafactual, so we have a pluperfect subjunctive on that side. So notice, two different kinds of conditions joined together. It's really not that hard because, once again, we just have this idea. It's contrafactual. When is the action occurring? Is it occurring in the past, present, or future? We have to ask that question of each different part. It's kind of like sequence of tenses. Same time, prior time, future time. When is this happening? So, If we look at the next clause, sentence, if she had worked any harder yesterday, she would be too tired to help today. So once again, we're looking for that word would. We see it. It's contrafactual, main clause. She would be too tired to help today. Would be, well, it's present. Too tired to help today. We have that today marker to really help nail down what time this is happening in. So once again, we have this present contrafactual idea in this main clause this time. She would be too tired to help today. Now we look at the if clause, the other half of the sentence. So we have a present contrafactual. If she had worked any harder yesterday, all right, when is this action occurring? This action is occurring in the past. So this was going to be a past contrafactual. Past contrafactual, once again, I'm going to go back to this chart again, over and over again, just because it's good to review. It's going to use the pluperfect subjunctive. So we're going to have, if she had worked harder, pluperfect subjunctive, she would be too tired to help today. And this is going to be a present contrafactual, so we'll use the imperfect subjunctive for this side. Notice, these both use two different kinds of conditions. They both use the same two, past contrafactual and present contrafactual. We've just switched which clause has each of them. That's kind of how all this mixing and matching is going to work. So, once again, let's not make this any harder than it needs to be. So, simple rules as you're going through this. Mixed condition just refers to tenses. Not everything has to be occurring at exactly the same time. We're not going to be mixing simple conditions and contrafactual conditions. We won't mix indicatives and subjunctives if they're both indicating parts of conditions. So if it's contrafactual, we'll use subjunctives. If it's simple, you'll use those indicatives. Lean into that. Let that help guide you. Alright, if the mixed condition is simple, don't spend a lot of time forcing yourself to figure out one half is future more vivid and one half is simple present. Just translate them, the Latin verbs, like there was no see or if there, and that will basically never lead you astray. In the futures, we talk a lot about the difference between if he will do this, he will be good. If he is doing this, he is good. We'll talk in this chapter, it talks about the difference between future perfects and futures inside of conditional clauses. But notice the difference between if he will have gone in a conditional clause and if he goes is really small. If you translate it as a future perfect, I'm not going to mark it wrong. I might say in better colloquial English, we say this. So really lean into using those indicative verbs to help guide you along in the right direction. Now, if it's contrafactual, use the chart, find the right keywords. You're still going to use should or were to for future, were for present, had in if clause, and then that would word needs to be in the main clause. And just translate it like they're two different parts. So just look for this part of the sentence, this is the keyword I need. For this part of the sentence, this is the keyword I need. Then put them together and see if it makes sense. Number 4, don't let it scare you. Just use the chart, slow down, make sure that everything here makes sense. And if you do that, it won't be so bad. Remember, the most important thing we're practicing here is identifying them, remembering that there is a chart, identifying when things are contrafactual and how to translate those. And if you've got those skills down, let's start there. So don't let it scare you too much. Cool. I was going to stop and I realized I had one more slide. Just really quick. Nisi. It's just a way of making that C clause a negative. It literally just means if not. You can translate as except or unless. Just always, if you're not sure how to translate if you're not sure if it means unless or except, just keep it super literal. If not is always going to be okay. Once again, if I think your sentence is really suffering because you used if not instead of unless or except, I'll just say in colloquial English, we'd say this. That's okay. Focus on the literal things for now. We can focus on getting pretty sounding translations later. Final note, remember that C clause can occur anywhere in the sentence, before the main clause, after the main clause, sandwiched in between the middle of the main clause. So just make sure you've identified where the C clause starts, where it ends. Most often it will be set off with a comma to help you, and if you do that, you should be fine.